Welcome to Supply Chain Management. This video, we're talking about transportation. Specifically, we will review the types of transportation modes. Then we will compare different dimensions of these transportation modes. And then we'll review my favorite topic, the economies of scales in the transportation context. So, do you recall our second definitions or point of view of logistics was about processes? And we said the logistics is that part of the supply chain that plans, implements, and control the efficient, effective storage and forward reverse flow of goods. Now, when we're talking about location of distribution center warehouses, we were talking about the storage of goods. In this video, we were going to focus on the flow, the transportation of goods, both forward and reverse motions. But to start, let's talk about the different types of transportation modes, at least the most common that we have today. And these are road, water, air, rail, pipeline, and then finally there's also the internet. Let's go review each of them individually. So road is probably the transportation mode that you are most familiar with. It consists of trucks and vans, for example. Here we have several images of possible trucks and vans. And as you can see, something that is very unique about this mode of transportation is that it has a large variety of product that it can transport. So you have here, we have the main regular, say, trucks. But in this photo here on the bottom, you can see it looks more like, the container looks more like a tube, so it can contain liquids, can transport liquids. In this situation, we can transport animals, we can have refrigerated containers, and then we have special containers that can carry very unique type of materials or items. In this case, for example, we have cars. So the containers can be quite customized and allow for large flexibility of products to be transported. Another great advantage of road transportation is that you can have a door-to-door delivery. So it's also very, the reach of this transport mode is very good. You can get to all sort of like small roads and locations around the world. And transport mode also have some limitations, and particularly has weight limits and also some restrictions often on the location that trucks can reach, especially, for example, in the city center, special times of the days. Some other disadvantages of road is that trucks can run into traffic and therefore be less reliable time-wise. And of course, in a way, it has also limits, therefore, on way to be transported. And this brings us to the next transportation mode, which is water. So it consists of ships. As you can see here, weight is really not an issue anymore. We have two types of ships. We have ocean ships, which are much larger and can carry this immense amount of containers and therefore of product. And then we can also have inland ships that travel on rivers. They tend to be a bit smaller, and they have the keel, so the bottom of the boat's a bit shallower, and they can still transport a fair amount of volume, just not as much as ocean ships. So clearly the two main advantages of water transportation is the large volume that they can transport, and because of it, the overall low cost of transport per unit. And of course, because they are so big, they can also transport product of much different shape that wouldn't fit, for example, in a container. So it allows also for this flexibility in product. They do have some disadvantages. So ships do have some disadvantages. The first one being that it is very slow, much as the slowest of all transport mode that we have nowadays, although it can ship product from really large distances. And some other disadvantages are actually piracy. It might seem strange, but there still is piracy nowadays. So that would cause loss of damage of product. Damage and loss of product can also occur because of overloading of of ships. You can see this is an example, and it is really not an unusual example. If you Google it online, you'll see quite a few of these kind of images and some poor organizations that can cause this one, but also it creates some port issues, such as this example here, a bit extreme. But therefore, that can also, that consists of disadvantages of water transportation. Let's move to air freight. Now, this is also something you're familiar with. Differently from water transportation, air transportation is much more limited in volume because it has to fit into an airplane. And of course, you cannot overload also in weight an airplane. Overall sizes of the product has to be limited. But of course, it can travel very large distances in very, very short time. So air freight is definitely the fastest of our transportation modes. Some of the disadvantages of it, of air freight transportation is, well, primarily is the cost. It's very expensive to transport items on air. And the reach is also relatively limited, as in there must be an airport nearby in order for the product to arrive there, which creates this NIMBY issue. NIMBY stands for not in my backyard, where a lot of people don't want to have airports nearby. So it limits the reach of this transportation mode. And the other limitation is actually on flexibility of product. Not just in volumes, but a lot of hazardous materials cannot be transported via air. And those that do, then usually the person that wants to transport, a company that wants to ship via air the product incurs a really high fee to allow for the safety of this of hazardous material transportation. Another important transport mode is rail. So trains. Trains, as you can see from this picture, can actually transport a really large volume of product. Not maybe as much as what ocean ships can, but still significant. And it's also much faster than an ocean, of course not as fast as an airplane, and it has quite a bit of reach. There are train stations in many areas, so the product can be arrived at almost any location one desires. And it's very well suited for long distance shippings. And so much so that because it is much cheaper than airplane, but faster than oceans, there has been more and more a trend to trying to ship product instead of via ocean or airplane, for example, from Eastern Asia to Europe. It's actually been this trend of trying to use the train to connect the two sides of the world. However, as you can see in this map, a train has to cross many borders, and some of these some of these countries are not necessarily politically stable, which means that the reliability of trains sometimes can be questionable because it crosses many borders. There might be fees or delays in custom clearance. So this is a trend, but definitely there is still progress to make in order to make this trip much more feasible and practical. Our last sort of physical transport mode is the pipeline. You might be less familiar with it. It's not something that you see very often because it consists of these gigantic tubes that cross very large areas and across countries. And most of the time, differently from this particular example, these tubes are actually built under, they're actually dug into the earth, so you don't actually see them. But they do transport for very large distances, quite large volume of product, and at quite a consistent rate. As you can see from these tubes, the product can go 24/7, doesn't have to stop, it's continuous flow, and at reasonable speed. Of course, what you can see also here is that the amount of product, the type of product that can be shipped is very limited. You have only a few gases and liquids that can be transported. Very common ones would be oil or methane, for example. but it is very popular transport mode. And as you can see here on the map on the top, you can see this is actually a net of pipelines that we have Europe and how it actually even connect to Africa and, for example, Russia and other countries surrounding us. So it is quite extensive, and it is actually very cheap. So it is not cheap to build the first time, as this picture shows. To actually build and have it set up, it is an expensive process, and of course then it cannot really change at will. But once it is there, then because it can flow consistently, right, and at good speed, it becomes our cheapest mode of transport for liquids and gases. So one disadvantage being that, of course, once the pipeline is created, it's been set, it doesn't have flexibility to reach all different destinations, so it doesn't have great reach, and it doesn't have great flexibility of product to be transported. But it definitely pays off when it comes in terms of cost and overall speed. Oh yes, and another great advantage is because it's often underground, it can prevent a lot of issues such as theft or disruption for all sorts. And the very last transport mode that we'll discuss, but very briefly here, is the internet, which is used mostly for service. It is really a transportation of data and information. And nowadays, it's kind of the basis of most of the businesses, specifically businesses that provide services. But in this video, we will focus more on the physical transport mode, so we will leave internet for another time. So here's some fun facts to give you an idea of how to compare all these transportation modes. We have a ship being an inland barge, can carry as much cargo as 60 trucks or about 40 railway wagons, while an ocean ship can carry as many containers as 700 trucks, so almost 10 times more. That's quite a significant difference. And that gives the idea of how big an ocean ship can be. This one is a very fun fact, very interesting fun fact, at least I found it very interesting. With the use of 5 liters of fuel, 1 ton of cargo can travel about 500 kilometers by ship, 300 kilometers by train, 100 by truck, and barely 6 kilometers by plane. So the plane has barely a chance to take off. It needs to land with an amount. This also says something about CO2 emission and usage. And finally, have one last comparison. It's about 1 kilometer of waterway infrastructure tends to carry about 3.5 million tons of cargo, while a 1 kilometer of railway infrastructure carries 2.5 million tons of cargo. And when we look at road infrastructure, then we goes down to barely 1.5 million tons of cargo. Lastly, one of the most important slides for you, this is where the comparison of the advantages and disadvantages of our 5 transportation modes are compared on these 6 dimensions. Flexibility, so amount of and types of product that can be shipped. Reach, how specific the location can be reached. Cost, speed, reliability, and then we have CO2 emission. As you can see here, road is definitely the winner when it comes to flexibility and reach. Can get about everywhere, can ship just about anything, compared to pipeline, which is much more restricted. The opposite actually comes from reliability and CO2 emission, where pipeline is the best among these 5 transport modes, and road actually doesn't fare very well. As far as cost to speed, we see that cost pipeline, once the pipeline is being set up, cost is by far the cheapest, and for speed, air is going to be the fastest. But of course, water is the slowest and air will be the most expensive. So this gives you an idea of how to compare different modes. And finally, I want to touch base on economies of scales as they relate to distance. Cost of transportation per unit, and this is important, that per unit, decreases when the load or the distance increases. So what does this mean? It means that if you have to ship something, you're better off shipping large volumes further away, as the per unit cost will be cheaper than if you're shipping fewer units to a location nearby. Now, this seems to be counterintuitive, but just imagine making a present. You're shipping, I don't know, a book to a friend. Imagine shipping a book to a friend that lives in the same city and shipping this book to a friend somewhere on the other side of the ocean. Of course, the overall price will be more expensive if you're shipping further away, but the per unit or the per kilometer cost will be smaller. All right, I hope that was clear enough. Summarizing for this video, we talk about different types of modes of transportation. We compare them, and then we talk about the economies of scales in the transportation context. I leave you with this brief true and false knowledge check and the answer upside down here at the bottom of the slide.